You were asked when you began working on analyzing phones in this case, and you said it was in May. Was that of May of 2023?
May of 2023. May 4th, 2023 is the email I have of a note. Thank you. Yes. It's easy to remember because May the 4th be with you.
When you first were asked to begin work on this case in May of 2023, what was the catalyst for you to begin working on this?
I was contacted by Mr. Tully and then contracted, a SAL was signed, and I began work on the initial request to look at those two search terms on January 29th. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
Okay.
Was there a certain claim that was lodged that you were to focus on?
I was to focus on the two search terms from January 29th, 2022.
And when you informed why, was there any context to that?
Probably, I don't recall the exact conversation that I had with the DA's office and Lieutenant Tully at that time, but I'm assuming that I was given that context. I have in my notes that I was to look at those two searches on that date and do an analysis about those.
Were you asked to reach any particular result?
No, I was asked to provide my report, not to reach a particular result.
Were you asked to reach a conclusion that the 227 timestamp was inaccurate?
No.
When you engaged in your analysis, was it independent of the district attorney's office?
My analysis was independent of the district attorney's office. I actually, in the first case, had very little communication with the district attorney's office during the period of my analysis.
Was there any input from any outside source on what your result or ultimate opinions would be?
No.
Would you ever allow anybody to affect your input?
No.
Throughout the course of your efforts with this phone, have there been changes to software?
Absolutely. As mentioned on direct, software updates are near monthly.
I want to ask you about changes to the Celebrite software. You were asked about certain reports you wrote. Were the reports that you wrote relative to different requests for analysis?
Yes.
The report regarding report number 3, regarding changes to Celebrite software, was that report limited to the timestamp change, or was it to include other efforts?
The scope of that report, may I review what I have documented as the
Please.
scope? I believe we're talking about report 2. That's the one about the Celebrate change?
Yes.
And I have the request was to understand changes made in the newer version of Celebrate Physical Analyzer to artifacts pertaining to the timeline of a particular Google search on January 29, 2022, namely how's long to die in cold.
When you looked at the Celebrite software and report, was the timestamp characterization changed or removed?
Yes, it was removed. That timestamp in the version starting in May of 2024, Celebrite actually removed that, and they put a release note stating that it was due to the ambiguity and potential for misconstruing the meaning of that data.
Was there any other releases informing other reasons why that was changed other than the potential that somebody could misconstrue, misinterpret, or distort the information?
Can I read Celebrite's own statement?
Please.
Celebrite's statement in...
To yourself.
To myself? Okay, roger that. Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you repeat the
Share with
question?
us, was there any reason other than the concern about misinterpreting or distorting?
They said that my understanding is that it is not a reliable timestamp, and that is why Celebrite removed it.
You were asked about Axiom. Axiom, is it the same or different?
Magnet Axiom and Celebrite Physical Analyzer are two different tools that both do forensic analysis of mobile phones.
You were asked whether Axiom still has a timestamp that was similar to Celebrite before the change.
Axiom shows what I spoke to on direct, where they have it as a parsed versus carved result. And so that particular result shows in the suspended state DB artifact as carved.
Do companies like Axiom and Celebrite give releases, updates, information about how to interpret their reports?
So Axiom actually has a document that's released with it called the Artifact Reference Guide, and that actually gives a brief description of the fields and of artifacts. All tools, when they release new artifacts, they put out in a release note. Not all artifacts are clearly documented that are parsed. However, all of the vendors regularly put out webinars and blog posts that explain their new artifacts, but not necessarily all.
Is there any releases or cautions from Axiom on the same issue about misinterpreting a timestamp?
Axiom, in their artifact reference guide for this artifact, does speak to the possibility of misinterpretation and states that the timestamp can be earlier than the search had occurred, based on what different reasons could cause that timestamp.
Let me ask you about a Faraday bag. You said that best practices is to isolate an item in a Faraday bag.
That's correct.
Do you have any information, or did you know the travel of Mr. O'Keefe's phone that night, or where it went after?
I'm sorry, can you clarify the time period?
On January 29, 2022, from, say, 6:04 in the morning until later that afternoon.
I did not have access to that information.
When you analyze data from certain devices, are they always placed in a Faraday bag immediately after an incident?
There's a lot of times when this is situation dependent. An example of when you would not put something in a Faraday bag is when you have a deceased victim and you're going to be using their biometrics to possibly unlock the device. Because a Faraday bag is enclosed and then can't be opened, if your intent, if you don't have the password, is to use a deceased person's fingerprint to unlock the phone, we don't want to put the person's finger in the Faraday bag, so usually those phones would not be Faradayed, but they would typically have airplane mode enabled or SIM card removed. But no, SIM card removed doesn't actually work on iOS, so I won't get into that.
Understanding or having the opinion that this item was not placed in a Faraday bag at 6:04 in the morning, does that in any way affect your opinions about the data that you analyzed on this phone and the conclusions that you reached regarding Mr. O'Keefe's phone?
It does not have any impact on the conclusions other than the fact that it wasn't Faradayed and more data came in. So we have additional data.
You were asked a very specific question about History DB, and it was simply whether or not How's Long to Die in Cold, whether it appeared in History DB. That isolated question, does that provide any context for you and your analysis and conclusions about How Long to Die in Cold and that it occurred at 6:23 and 6:24 the next morning?
The absence of the History DB artifact doesn't mean that that search didn't occur at that time. We have multiple corroborating artifacts, which is usually what we look for, 2 artifacts that demonstrate is like very good. You don't necessarily need that, but in this instance, we have both from the Mobile Safari plist, which tracks the history, as well as the Knowledge C DB. So we do have 2 artifacts showing that those searches were done at that time. Of course, 6 seconds apart for the difference between the Knowledge C and the Mobile Safari plist.
On direct examination, you were not asked questions about Mr. O'Keefe's phone.
That is
but
correct.
You were on cross-examination, so let me follow up. You have a report that you authored regarding Mr. O'Keefe's phone,
That is correct.
and you had an opportunity to look at the healthcare data for January 29, 2022,
That is correct.
page 6 of your report.
Thank you.
You noted that there were steps that began at 12:11:09 a.m. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
And the way healthcare data works, do you have an understanding whether steps means a person actually took a number of steps, or does it mean something else?
Steps doesn't necessarily mean that you took a number of steps. It's based on the motion of the device. So it could be steps. It could be you're carrying it. It could be that you're in some other kind of motion. You could be on a bicycle. You could, any number of things. And the number of steps is based on the presumed gait, based on the input into the Apple Health app in terms of gender and height. So it determines a gait and then prescribes a number of steps, but it is possible for other things to cause steps to occur.
You were asked specifically if you saw that there were reported movement or health steps at 12:21:10 a.m. and specifically pointed out to you notation or characterization of 80 steps. Is that accurate?
That is what's stored in the database. I try to clarify, as I did for you, sir, that that's what's stored in the database. I'm not saying that 80 steps were taken.
And by the way, in addition to the healthcare analysis, you did some analysis on the movement of a car, didn't you?
From
Your Honor. I'm going to deny that question.
Can these health steps occur if somebody's holding a phone while traveling in a car?
As mentioned in my report, it's caused by motion. It could be various motions that could cause it. You could be using an elliptical, you could be in a vehicle, you could be on a bicycle. It's not necessarily steps taken.
Based on your analysis of Mr. O'Keefe's phone and the report that was pointed out to you in cross-examination, and do you have information or opinion where Mr. O'Keefe's phone was located around 12:21:10 while those steps registered?
Objection, Your Honor. Go.
That's beyond the scope of the process.
It was pointed out to you at 12:21:10 there was a registered 80 steps. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
And then you were also asked about the last healthcare data, the last movements of this phone. And it was pointed out that that began at 12:31:56 for 20 seconds.
That's correct. Per the data in the database.
And is that the last movement of Mr. O'Keefe's phone that evening before 6:04 that you saw when you analyzed the entire data in the phone?
May I have one moment to review?
Yes.
That appears to be the last before the 6 a.m. hour.
And so that 20 seconds, if it began at 12:31:56, what was the last movement in seconds in time at that time of Mr. O'Keefe's phone?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Yes, if that was a 20-second interval at
That's correct.
12:31:56, what was the last second that evening that Mr. O'Keefe's phone moved?
12:32:16.
And then when you analyzed the phone and were asked about these times, is there any movement between that last movement and 6:04:01?
Between the 12:32?
Yes, 12:32:16 and 6:04:01. Any movement of that phone whatsoever?
I do not have anything supporting that in my report.
Do you know what was going on with Mr. O'Keefe's phone at 6:04:01 a.m. on the morning of January 29, 2022?
I do not know precisely what was happening with his phone at that time in terms of movement. If that's, or are you asking me? I'm sorry. Can you clarify what you mean
Yes.
by the question?
The next movement after 12:32
Is the 6:04?
6:04:01
Correct.
a.m.
Correct.
Do you have any information about where or why there was movement of the phone at that time?
I don't. That wouldn't be inside my digital evidence, I don't believe.
And the last question is, the next movement at 6:15:14, do you know if that phone was being moved by somebody or somebody else than Mr.
The
O'Keefe?
phone was in motion. I do not know if it could be by a person, it could be on a rail car. I don't think it was on a rail car for clarity, but I don't know what is causing that motion at that time.
Thank you very much.